This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Baer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is brought to you by Baer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down but never dumb down complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. It is so wonderful to have Dr. Sabine Hossenfelder on the show today. Sabine is presently a research fellow at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies in Germany and has published more than 80 research articles about the foundations of physics, including quantum gravity, physics beyond the standard model, dark matter, and quantum foundations. Sabine's book, Existential Physics, was published in August 2022. She's written about physics for a broad audience for 15 years and is the creator of the popular YouTube channel Science Without the Gobbledygook, which we will have a link to in the show notes, of course, accompanying this episode, as well as her latest book. Sabine's writing has been published in New Scientist, Scientific American, The New York Times, and The Guardian. Sabine's first book, Lost in Math: How Beauty Leads Physics Astray, appeared in 2018. Sabine earned her Ph.D. in physics from Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. Welcome to the show, Sabine. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Hi, Mark. Good to talk to you.
So in your excellent book, Existential Physics, you tackle so many fascinating questions that also can be frustratingly difficult to answer, such as, does the past still exist, or was the universe made for us, among many others in the book. You also write that for you, science is an inspiration, not just a profession, which I thought was really interesting. Can you give listeners a sense of what you mean by an inspiration and what inspires you in your own work?
I think science opens our mind to possibilities that we wouldn't otherwise even have thought about. And that's in particular when we talk about physics. Think about stuff that you read about in science fiction or see in movies, stuff like parallel universes or time can slow down in nearby black holes or wormholes and that kind of stuff. It all comes out of physics. And I think this is a side of physics that we don't celebrate enough, that it opens your mind to those really big ideas. And it's something that I think is generally the case for other types of science. I always find it fascinating to read about those insights that we have gained. For example, I was recently reading something about embryology, like how does a human being grow out of a single cell? And it's remarkably complex, and I just find it so amazing. And this is what I mean when I say it. To me, it's more an inspiration rather than a profession.
Yes, so true. And in addition to your books and research articles, as I mentioned, you're also the creator of the YouTube channel Science Without the Gobbledygook. It has 515,000 subscribers and counting so far. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. What led you to start the channel?
So I'd been working as a freelance science writer for some time. I can't really remember, 5-10 years, something like this. And the way that it works, if you're a freelance writer, is that you have to formulate a kind of a pitch. So that's like a short summary of your story. And you send it to editors of magazines, newspapers, and so on. And then they tell you, yes, that sounds interesting. And you get an assignment, or you don't. And you learn very quickly that there are basically only certain things that they'll be interested in running. Typically, it shouldn't be something old. It has to have some kind of timely hook. And it shouldn't be too controversial, pretend to be controversial, but it shouldn't really be controversial. And I just found it terribly frustrating because there were things that I thought were interesting and also important to write about that I just couldn't place anywhere. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to be my own editor. I'm going to put my stuff on YouTube. And then it worked pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've watched many of the videos. They're fantastic. And many of the topics that you cover in your episodes, and there's a new one every Saturday on the channel, they're complex. Quantum physics, expansion of the universe. These are really interesting, mind-expanding things. Einstein's theories of relativity. In the trailer or the channel, you tell viewers that you're going to make your explanations as simple as possible, but not any simpler. And I thought that phrasing was just really different from what I've heard before. What do you mean by that? And I have a second question I'll ask you about that regarding oversimplification.
Yeah, so what I mean is that in a lot of those stories that you read in the popular science news, there are always some ifs and buts that they don't tell you about. And I know this in my own discipline. If I read something, for dark matter is a typical example where they'll tell you, oh, it's made of some kind of particle, and then they've built some kind of experiment where they're trying to measure the thing. But they don't really tell you that we have no reason to think that those particles exist in the first place. And so that's a pretty big but that I think maybe should have been mentioned. And it makes me very skeptical when I read something about discipline where I'm not an expert. Like maybe they left out some pretty big but and they just don't tell us. And so what I try to do in my channel, I try to add those buts. It doesn't mean that something is completely uninteresting, but I think people need to know the context and they need to know exactly what were the assumptions.
That leads to my follow-on question, which is, what do you think the motivation of leaving that information out is? As you point out, it can be really critical, like our degree of confidence is lower or not statistically significant or something that's a caveat there. Why do you think that isn't included?
I think there are actually several different reasons. One reason is that it's easier for the writer. If you don't have to explain the details, you don't have to worry about it. Another problem is probably, and I think this is a mistake, I think that a lot of outlets underestimate how much their readers know and how much they want to know. And the reason I'm saying this is that I think of myself as the typical reader of science news in areas other than my own. And I am very skeptical that they actually tell me the whole story. And so I think that a lot of the science news, they are aimed at an audience which has a far lower level of education than is the reader that would typically read science news in the first place.
For sure. It's so interesting to try to gauge that. So you've come up with your own approach and your own principles related to explaining extremely abstract and difficult to grasp topics. As you point out, that was really the origin story for your YouTube channel. And so as you go about explaining these topics, in many ways, you're translating them into terms and concepts that are relatable, but also have the buts or details. Can you describe overall your approach about how you go about this translation process, so to speak, figuratively speaking, and any specific principles that you put to use that you find are particularly effective? Because you've noted that you want to make sure that important uncertainties are expressed. At some point, you have to decide that's too much detail, then you're going to be writing a journal article, and that's not the purpose. You have a certain amount of time for these clips, for example.
Yeah, that's right. I think the overarching approach that I'm taking is basically a scientific one. I look at what works and I try to learn from the mistakes that I've made. If you dig back into my channel and into my writing, you'll see that it has changed a lot. And in this, I very heavily rely on the feedback I get from the people who watch my videos and who read my articles. And every time I have the impression that something doesn't properly work, I try to work on this. But one of the things that I always try to keep in mind is a problem that I myself face if I watch a video or read an article about a topic that I'm not familiar with. Typically, it might be something like neurobiology or medicine or stuff like this. It's a concept I've heard being referred to as cognitive load. So if you're explaining something that the reader or the listener is not familiar with, you have to explain the term. But at some point, you have explained so many terms that they start dropping out at the back of your head. So it's something to avoid. And it's not because the listener is stupid. They can very well understand all those details. It's just that you have a limited attention span, or maybe you stop the video in between and then you go for a walk with your dog or something. And then you come back and you've forgotten it all. So I try to minimize the cognitive load. For example, I never assume that people have watched other videos that I've made. It's something which I tried in the past, but I've stopped doing it because I think it doesn't work. So I want people to come to my channel, and every video that they click on, it can stand on its own. So sometimes, of course, I will refer to something that I've explained in more detail elsewhere, but I try to make each video self-contained. I try to keep the technical terms to a minimum, and I often remind people, like if I've been talking for 10 minutes, then I might remind them of something that I already said earlier, just to bring it back into their awareness, basically. And I also, as you already said, I try to focus on a particular topic. I try to keep it to 15 minutes. Sometimes it's maybe a little bit longer, but roughly. And that's often difficult. We have to kick out some things where I sometimes think, oh, maybe we should have added it. But if it's not really necessary, I tend to kick it out.
Those are really valuable principles, Dr. Hossenfelder, for all of us to remember. Thanks for highlighting that concept of cognitive load. I want to ask you, you also mentioned when you're reading something that you're not a specialist in, how you approach it and how you use it. I'm going to ask you about public health communication. You're not an expert in public health as far as I know, but you are an expert science communicator. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how well government authorities in general have been doing when it comes to communicating complicated science-focused topics that affect all of us. And I'm talking about, of course, COVID, climate. We're talking about monkeypox more now in August of 2022. How do you think governments have been doing, just broadly speaking, when it comes to their level of effectiveness in getting that information out in ways that don't overload the public, but still provide information that's memorable and that's actionable for people?
Yeah, as they say, mistakes have been made. I think it's been quite different from one country to the other. So I think there's no overall statement that can be made, but I think it's generally very difficult. Not only have to send a specific message, you often also have to do it very quickly. So even 15 minutes is too much for a lot of those messages. And so a simple picture or simple message has to do. And there's a lot that gets lost in that. And I think when it comes to messages from government or governmental institutions and so on, then the difficult part that I think hasn't really been paid enough attention to is that you have to separate the scientific facts, like what do you know, to the best current knowledge, from the value decisions that you attach to them, and then to the policies that have come out of it. And I think in a lot of communication that I have seen, and it's not just governments, but also in newspapers and scientists on Twitter, actually, they tend to mix those two things together. It's, okay, we have those studies and they've shown ABC and this is all well and fine, and then therefore you should do this. And this is where I get a problem, because in this, therefore you should do this, there's always some kind of value judgment that came in and that wasn't explicitly pointed out. And I think this frustrates a lot of people, especially those who have different value judgments, because they just feel that their opinions have totally been thrown out of the window.
So important. I'm thinking about masking, for example, and some of these other protocols. Really great, that step that's often left out. So as we wrap up, Dr. Hossenfelder, on your YouTube channel, there's one episode I just want to highlight and ask you more about, and that's, does the past still exist? It's also in your book. It's been watched more than 1 million times, 1.2 million and counting. In Existential Physics, which, as I pointed out, is your great new book that just is coming out in August 2022, you cite Einstein's theory of special relativity in writing that, according to established laws of nature, the future, the present, the past, they all exist in the same way, which to me was like a mind-blowing concept. As a physicist deeply exploring and explaining these topics, how do you think about your own future future? And what's your definition of free will? Because you work that into this explanation. And by that, I mean your ability to shape your own future.
Yeah, this video, which addresses the question, does the past still exist, is a good example for exactly the kind of problem that I was talking about earlier. Imagine trying to pitch an article about a theory that's allegedly more than 100 years old, and then trying to pick up this question that people have discussed for 100 years. Do you think anyone would run it? I'm very skeptical. I probably wouldn't have been able to place this anywhere, but put it in YouTube and a million people watched it. So I think that shows that people are really interested in that kind of thing. And yes, it's really mind-blowing. It's one of those things that we learn as physics students, like in the first semester or something. And then for a week, you just walk around like, really? This can't possibly be true. But then you get used to it at some point and you just accept it as this is the way that things are. And so to some extent, I do those things to remind myself about how mind-blowing it really is. And yeah, so the brief summary of this argument, which comes out of Einstein's theory of special relativity, as you say correctly, is that you cannot define any specific moment as now. And basically the reason is that every moment, also those in the past, could be now for somebody. And so who are you to say that your now is any better than somebody else's now? And so the only logical conclusion that you can draw from this is that all moments exist the same way, and that includes the past, present, and the future. This is for what Einstein is concerned. So now if you take into account quantum mechanics, it becomes a little bit more difficult to talk about the future, which is why my video is called Does the Past Still Exist and not Does the Future Already Exist? And this is because in quantum mechanics, we have this random element. So every time we look at a particle, it makes a quantum jump, basically. And this is completely undetermined. It's fundamentally random. If quantum mechanics is correct, that's a different can of worms that I'm not going to open. If you think it's correct, then the future is not yet fixed, but it has this random element to it. So you also asked about free will. I have big difficulties making sense of this notion of free will. But I can ask you, so if you know that this is how the laws of nature work, so we have those deterministic laws, and then every once in a while, there's a random jump, and this is what the particles in your brain do. They're either determined by the past or there's some random element that no one can predict. Would you say that you have free will?
The way I look at this is like some software comes preloaded and you don't have a lot of ability to impact that. But then there's other software that you're loading on or that you're choosing to download. And that's where the free will element comes in. Even with my kids, I feel like that. Raising kids, like they say some things that are similar to what I would think they would say that we've never had a conversation about. And I wonder, wow, they're similar to my thinking in this way, and they've never been exposed to this aspect before. But then they come up with stuff that is clearly coming from somewhere else, or they do things that I didn't teach them to do. And that's where I feel that the free will aspect comes in.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good answer. And I think that this is very similar to how some philosophers have tried to explain a notion of free will that's very much based on the autonomy by which the brain works, that it seems to come up with those new things pretty much independently of its genetically determined, environmentally determined hardware, so to speak. And that's a possible definition for free will that you can use.
Just great. I would love to talk to you for hours and hours and learn so many things, but you have to get rolling. This has just been wonderful, though. Dr. Sabine Hossenfelder, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for writing this book. Thanks for making it so accessible to people like me who got a C in physics in high school, who've still ventured in and wanted to learn from you and learn more about physics. I really appreciate it. I know our listeners are going to love this episode.
Lovely to talk to you.
All right, listeners, thanks so much for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.